With the release of the 7th Walpurgisnacht, we got 2 brand new identities. And not too long ago, I went over Jong's office rep Ishmael in all her glory, looking at every part of her kit and comparing her to her competition. And today, it's time for us to look at the second unit introduced in this update. Night Awl Capitano Gregor. Gregor is a Tremor bleed identity, and is our second source of Tremor Hemorrhage, meaning he's trying to make the Blammer dream a reality once more, after the not-so-successful attempt that Encore Proshu had. He also has unique effects and mechanics, all of which make him an interesting identity to use. But is he strong enough to make a place for himself on his signature teams? If so, how does he do it? And what are his strengths? I aim to answer all of that today, by first looking at Gregor's kit and then checking out his performance in the Tremor and Bleed teams, while also comparing him to Encore Proshu along the way. But before we start, I have to remind you that most of my viewers are not subscribed. So if you find yourself coming back to my videos or end up enjoying this one, consider subscribing. It takes just a second and helps me out a lot. Now let's get to Gregor. We'll start with his kit. Capitano Gregor has fairly low health, below average speed and a low defense level. His Sin Affinity spread consists of Sloth, Lust and Pride, with a Lust defense. His first skill is Gap Attack. It rolls up to 15, gains coin power from Bleed and Tremor on the enemy, gives Gregor 1 haste, and inflicts 2 Tremor and Bleed, as well as 1 open wound with its coins. Gregor also has an alternate skill 1, and this one probably has some Italian pronunciation, but I'll call it Mercy. It's unclashable, rolls up to 14, does not trigger defensive skills or generate ego resources, gets more coin power and damage based on missing health on the enemy, grants Gregor 1 haste, and inflicts 1 Tremor, Bleed and open wound. Gregor's second skill is Stiletto Doppio. It rolls up to 22, gains coin power from Bleed and Tremor, and on Clash Win it inflicts 1 Tremor and bursts it, reducing the count by 1. The coins of the skill inflict 1 Tremor and Bleed count, as well as 1 open wound, and if the third coin hits an enemy with 20% HP or less, or with fatal wound, Gregor gets to use his skill 1-2. His third skill is Execution. This skill rolls up to 24, inflicts 2 Tremor and bursts it on Clash Win, while reducing the count by 1, and the coins of the skill inflict 3 Tremor and Bleed, as well as 1 Tremor count and 1 open wound. The last coin of the skill converts Tremor to Tremor Hemorrhage, bursts it, and if it hits a low HP enemy or an enemy with fatal wound, Gregor uses his skill 1-2. However, if the enemy has deep wound, Execution turns into the Night's Awl, Gregor's skill 3-2. This skill rolls up to 28, gains coin power as usual, deals extra damage based on bind on the enemy and haste on Gregor, deals more damage to targets with shield HP, and deals even more damage based on the enemy's missing health. Also, on use, it inflicts 5 defense level down, and on Clash Win, the skill inflicts 4 Tremor and bursts it for free. The coins of the skill inflict 4 Bleed and Tremor, as well as 1 Bleed count and 2 Tremor count. The last coin of the skill converts Tremor on the enemy to Tremor Hemorrhage, and then bursts Tremor twice, while reducing the count by 2. Also, it converts Deep Wound on the enemy into Fatal Wound next turn. As for Gregor's defense, he gets a Clashable Guard. It rolls up to 15, and at combat start it allows Gregor's passive to activate Mercy twice in one turn, while also giving Gregor 1 haste next turn. On Clash Win, the skill inflicts 2 Tremor. As for Gregor's passives, he has 2. His first one states that his skill 1 tool can only be used up to 2 times per turn, unless reused via external effects. His second passive requires 2 sloth and lust owned, and it gives Gregor a couple of effects. When he kills an enemy or breaks a part, Gregor gains 2 pierce power up next turn, once per turn. When Gregor uses a base attack skill against a slower target, he inflicts defense power down based on the speed difference, up to 2 per turn. Also, if an enemy is under 20% HP after an ally's attack, Gregor uses Mercy on that enemy. If there's only one enemy present, this effect activates on stagger as well. Still, it only works once per turn. As for his support passive, Gregor has Aim for the Gap. It requires 3 Sloth Resonance, and it effectively grants the defense power down infliction from his passive to the fastest ally. This is it for Gregor's skills, but he has a couple of unique effects that he works with, so let's look at those. Open Wound stacks up to 2, and at turn end it inflicts 1 bind on the afflicted enemy. When the stack hits 2, the effect gets converted into Deep Wound next turn. Deep Wound has a base stack of 3. It inflicts 1 bleed count against the afflicted enemy on Tremor burst, up to 2 times per turn, and also inflicts the enemy with bind equal to the stack of Deep Wound -1 next turn. While Deep Wound is on the enemy, that enemy cannot gain Open Wound, and at turn end the stack goes down by 1. Fatal Wound is the final and strongest effect. It's a copy of Deep Wound effectively, but it inflicts 2 more bleed count on burst and also inflicts 1 more bind at turn end. Other than that, it's the same. With this, we're done with Gregor's kit, which means that we're ready to look at him in combat. As Gregor is a Tremor bleed identity, we'll be looking at him in both teams separately. But before that, how is he played? Well, unlike Hanafuda Ishmael, the other ID on the same banner, Gregor has a pretty simple playstyle. Most of his kit's strength is loaded into his skill 3 too, as it deals a whole bunch of damage, inflicts Tremor Hemorrhage, and also inflicts Fatal Wound. Getting access to this skill is pretty simple, as all you need to do is inflict Deep Wound on the enemy, which requires you to hit them twice with Gregor's other skills. As early as turn 3, you're able to go for the Night Awl. Do note though that while the skill is easily accessible, holding onto it can benefit your overall damage output, as it gets much stronger when the enemy's HP is low. Gregor's skill 3-2 gets stronger when used after a skill 1, as that skill provides him with haste, which makes Night Awl deal more damage. Also, his skill 2 gets stronger if used after a skill 3-2, as Fatal Wound on the enemy lets the skill proc Mercy, making Gregor deal more damage. This pretty much paints the picture of his best rotation, as you want to start out by using Gregor's first skill a couple times, then use his nuke, and then follow up with skill 2s. Now, I'm not saying that Gregor is unplayable unless you use him like this, but his skills do benefit from a particular order, which makes reaching his peak a bit inconsistent. As for Gregor's Mercy gimmick, for the most part it's just free extra damage. The one time you need to think when using it is against enemy groups. Being aware of how much damage your skills do can allow you to not waste skills on low HP enemies, as Gregor's Mercy can finish off low HP targets on its own. Saying any more than this would require me to look at Gregor in one of his teams. And that's exactly what we're going to do right now. And we'll start with Gregor's performance in Tremor. In the Tremor team, Gregor takes the same role as Encore Pyoshu, being the Hemorrhage setter. Hemorrhage is a damaging Tremor type, meaning that even though it's difficult to get max value out of it, it's still a valuable thing to have on the enemy to make every following burst stronger. Outside of this effect, Gregor prides himself on his triple burst on his skill 3 too, with 2 of those bursts taking advantage of the newly applied Hemorrhage, his high damage on his skill 3 too, and his pretty nice Tremor infliction in the form of 8 Tremor on his skill 3 too. As you can see, Gregor's performance in Tremor hinges entirely on his strongest skill. However, that skill is very good, so he does not disappoint. The main thing that Gregor can provide your team with is a triple burst Hemorrhage setting skill during the nuke turn, greatly helping with bursting down bosses of any kind using the Tremor team. His speed is pretty bad though, so to get max value out of his gimmick, you want to make sure to use a skill 1 right before going into the nuke turn, thus turning Gregor's speed roll into 4 to 7, which is a lot more respectable, and a lot more likely to go before more allies, thus spreading Hemorrhage to more bursts. Gregor's skill 3-2 becomes available at turn 3, meaning that he's able to contribute to low turn clears of bosses in the same way as Encore Pyoshu. And speaking of Encore Pyoshu, we've got a comparison on our hands. The two units have extremely similar niches. Both set up the same Tremor type for their team with the same speed. Both have kits that rely mostly on their strongest skill, and both can be used for low turn clear shenanigans. So which one should you use? Looking at Encore Pyoshu, we can see that her skill 3-2 only bursts Tremor once, and only inflicts 4 Tremor, meaning that outside of Hemorrhage, all Ryoshu has to rely on is her physical damage, which admittedly is very high. The damage that Cascading Gaze of Awe underneath Contempt can deal easily reaches over 200, and you can expect the skill to hit for 230. Zooming out a bit to the rest of her kit, the most Tremor Ryoshu can inflict in one rotation is 8, which is not a lot, to put it lightly. Of course, in this case, the Hemorrhage is the trade-off for the low infliction, as having an extra damaging Tremor type has pretty much the same effect as having more Tremor on the enemy with less damaging Tremor types. In the case of Gregor, he is straight up just better. His skill 3-2 bursts Tremor 3 times and inflicts 8 Tremor, instantly getting a lot more value out of the Tremor stack on the enemy and converting it to more damage. Speaking of damage, while Gregor does not deal as much as Ryoshu, he also doesn't have a weak skill 3-2, being able to deal well over 150 physical damage, while once again outputting more via his 2 extra bursts. Once again, zooming out to other skills beyond the Night's Awl, we can see that if you're aiming for a turn 3 nuke, Gregor can output a total of 12 Tremor without mercy, which gets bumped up to a max of 14 if you're aiming for a turn 4 nuke. With Gregor's speed reaching the same values as Ryoshu's, there isn't a single metric where she has him beat, meaning that if you're a fan of using Hemorrhage for bursting down bosses, Gregor is straight up the same unit as Encore Pyoshu, but slightly better on all accounts. Of course, the two IDs belong to different sinners, so a question of why not run both might arise. And as I explained while talking about Ryoshu, Hemorrhage comes at the cost of not having much Tremor infliction, and in Ryoshu's case, many bursts. And now that Gregor can set up the exact same effect while not having those issues, or at least dealing with them slightly better, Ryoshu does not need to stay, as her Hemorrhage cannot stack on top of Gregor's Hemorrhage, obviously, so she can be replaced by an AD that bursts more or inflicts more Tremor, thus resulting in more overall damage. Outside of quick boss kills, which is Tremor's forte, Gregor can also find a lot of value in AoE encounters. As explained previously, his skill 1-2, activated through his passive, can be used as pseudo AoE to take down low HP enemies that narrowly avoided death at the hands of an ally. This is best done against Pierce weak enemies, as Gregor is mono Pierce. However, outside of Mercy, Alan Gregor also has access to a limited Arknight's collab ego in Unbrilliant Glory. And while the skill is limited, and as such not everyone has it, I do have to note that prior to the release of Alan Gregor, the skill did not have any good Gregor identity that could use it in Tremor, and now that the new unit is in the game, he can fill that spot and become the ultimate Tremor mobbing ID. With this, it's safe to assume that Gregor is in fact a good Tremor identity. However, is he as good in Bleed? Well, Gregor's kit has a couple of things that are important to this team. His skill 2 is Lust, meaning he can contribute to resonance effectively. His damage is quite high, meaning he doesn't need to rely on his bleed infliction. Speaking of his bleed though, it's not great. Both the potency and count infliction on his skills alone is pretty low. That being said, Tremor Hemorrhage still continues existing and can add extra damage into Gregor's skills via bursts, if you manage to keep it up. And finally, all the wound effects that I ignored for the duration of the Tremor segment are also interesting in Bleed. So let's look closer. First, let's talk about the wounds. I am sure when looking at this ID's kit, Gregor's ability to inflict 3 bleed count on Tremor Burst with Fatal Wound on the enemy caught your eye, as that's quite a high amount of bleed count infliction for one effect. Sure, it's capped at 2 procs per turn and lasts for 3 turns, but that's more than enough time to squeeze out a lot of value from the effect. Is what I would have said if the effect was good. See, Fatal Wound is an interesting buff to Hemorrhage in Bleed, as the effect makes that Tremor type go from consuming bleed count to deal damage to giving both damage and bleed count. However, it has some issues. The most glaring one is your way of obtaining the effect. Fatal Wound exists only within Gregor's skill 3-2, and that skill applies the effect next turn. And with skill 3-2 requiring Deep Wound on the enemy to be used, the absolute earliest turn during which you can take advantage of Fatal Wound is turn 4. This is far too late for a count inflicting effect, as count gained from identities really only matters up until you fuel Sanguine Desire, aka for the first 2 turns. And by turn 4, the issue of count should already be solved. If it's not, you have bigger fish to fry, as your team must have not done anything in the 3 turns preceding this one. But of course, Fatal Wound is not all Gregor has for this team. The main thing Gregor provides is damage, as his bleed infliction is far from impressive. However, this extra damage is quite good, and mostly shines against enemy groups or back-to-back fights against enemies that reach low HP quickly, such as the current Refraction Railway. In fights like these, Gregor can utilize his skill 1-2 often, which is the one thing that can add up over time and put him ahead of his competition in terms of physical damage. Another thing that he's got is, of course, Hemorrhage. This effect serves as extra damage on Gregor's skill 3-2. And well, that's kind of it. See, Hemorrhage on an identity that bursts fairly consistently can be very beneficial, as Gregor can take the stack of bleed on the enemy and deal extra damage based on its potency value. However, for this to work, you need enough tremor count on the enemy to not drop the stack while bursting, and this is the part that Gregor struggles with. Looking at his kit, he goes neutral on pretty much every skill, not leaving a tremor stack behind to capitalize on later. And at this point, you'd expect me to say how using him alongside Anchor Pyoshu actually fixes this issue, but sadly, it does not. Ryoshu, much like Gregor, has very little tremor count infliction, not enough to make the Hemorrhage stack last. The actual saving grace for this effect is Rin Yi-Sang and a whole lot of luck. Of course, I'm not saying this seriously. Relying on Rin for tremor count is not exactly something you should be doing, but it can come up and let your Gregor burst once or twice more into Hemorrhage before the stack gets dropped. Overall, in Bleed, Gregor does not have the effect infliction numbers needed to make Hemorrhage work, and his fatal wound effect comes in way too late to have an impact on a boss fight. Still, the physical damage of this ID may convince you to use him in Bleed. And in certain encounters, Gregor does get to utilize his skill 1-2 gimmick more, making himself a situationally useful Bleed pick, and an ID that might come up later if we get a Hemorrhage unit that has a lot of tremor count. With this, my overview of the Night Awl Capitano Gregor identity comes to an end. He's a promising unit in the Tremor team, shining in both boss low turns and AoE encounters. In Bleed though, I'd call him perfectly skippable. He can find play under specific conditions, but generally you don't gain much for slotting him over one of the currently strong Bleed identities. That being said, he's not weak, he just has incredibly tough competition, and under-delivers on some of his promises. Should you pull him? Well, we're 5 days into Warp right now. If you wanted to, you pulled him already, so what does it matter what I have to say? If you disagree or have something to add, feel free to leave a comment below, and I might read it. If you enjoyed the video at any point, leave a like to let me know, and if you want to see more like this, consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye!